Continuing on from last time, let's consider God's life as Trinity, and in particular, let's unpack a little bit further the implications of the doctrine of divine simplicity. So divine simplicity would affirm the utter union, the completeness, the fullness of God, that He is indivisible. He is not a compound that has been composed from something ulterior to Him, but rather God's life is absolutely independent. His aseity is unique and solitary, and so there is only one divine being, and that divine being is our true and living God. And His life is indivisible into parts, but is fully unified, and that is described to us with this doctrine of divine simplicity. Now, a couple of reasons why that's important. Sometimes when we're reading the Bible, we can get the feeling that God is at tension within Himself, that sometimes He is being generous and kind and blessing the people or the nations or an individual, and other times He's really, annoyed or disappointed and is into discipline and judgment. And so sometimes it feels like within God there's these different dimensions of His being, of His attitude, of His heart, that compete against each other. Will He be just or will He be merciful? Will He be loving or will He be severe? Will it be judgment or will it be blessing? And reading the stories, it sometimes feels like, well, that sounds like what God's like. However, the problem that we bump into there is that we then have a God who is conflicted. Right? We have a God who is unable to fully express anything of who He is because He's always competing within Himself. The doctrine of divine simplicity does something quite genius, and that is it looks beyond those tensions that we relate to as human beings, and then actually proposes that no, within God, what we experience are just slivers of His fullness. And God's expression of Himself within that, there is no tension. It's not like His justice is competing against His mercy, or His love is competing against His wrath, but rather within God there is the fullness of all that He is, and the totality of His being is being expressed in these different ways, in these slivers of these stories that we can grasp some of. But then we look at, and we have to just, in a sense, step back in stunned silence to say there is more to God. There is always more to God. God is utterly transcendent and other. And so the doctrine of divine simplicity requires us and calls and challenges us to look beyond a very human interpretation of the emotions of God, and to realize that within God there is no tension. God is simply being Himself in a way that we find hard to understand and yet receive by faith. Another dimension of divine simplicity and why it's important is when it comes to understanding the Trinity. Because sometimes we think, well, within God the Father is maybe a bit more severe, and the Son is really courageous and loving and humble, and the Spirit is maybe a bit more mischievous and elusive and mysterious, and there's this sense of there's differences of attitude, differences of agenda, differences of ideas or heart or emotion. Again, divine simplicity rises above that and calls us to engage our mind in a different way, to think, if God is truly this union of the fullness of His own being, then the glorious mystery of the Trinity is that within God there is only one nature. There is only one will, there is only one mind. There is the singular affections of God being expressed through the Father, through the Son, and through the Spirit. And so we bump in again to this extraordinary mystery called the Trinity. How can God be simple in that philosophical way, but at the same time be relational and personal with the personhoods of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? So there is no answer to this other than it is a beautiful, extraordinary mystery, that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are one and yet three. And divine simplicity requires us to receive that in a mature way, that the Trinity are in no way competitive, or in some way there's tension between them on how they're going to complete the task or the vision that they have for creation, but rather there's beautiful unity and the deepest of inseparable harmonies between Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And again, this brings us to the place where our minds run out of horsepower, our words run out of vocabulary, our imagination runs out of vista, and we can't go any further. And that's when we're worshipping. We are in touch with reality right there. So bless you as you consider these things. Peace.